Hi guys, hope you're doing well. Welcome to a new video. In this video, I want to have a look at some of the lighting techniques that I use for my Lies of P artwork. But this isn't really a tutorial video. While there's going to be a technique and some of the ideas that I use how to set up some of the more elaborate lighting, this is more of a methodology video. And by methodology, I mean why I light scenes in a certain way, what's the goal of the lighting that I'm trying to get, what are some of the ideas behind the storytelling. Because I really feel like one of the core elements of lighting that's overlooked quite a lot by 3D artists is the storytelling element, right? Like it's one of those things that I think, depending on your approach, might not be the first thing you think about when you think about just scene, is how you're gonna light that scene. I think it's one of those things that is overlooked because it's such an obvious thing in 3D that you're gonna light your scene, but it's not necessarily obvious that it's supposed to tell a story and supposed to guide the eye. And I think, like, especially with 3D, you know, it kind of looking at photography and how that operates as well, is you really are painting with light, and a lot of your story happens with the mood and the setup that lights guide. And I think one of the key things for that is really think about your lighting and give yourself some time to experiment and see what works and why, what doesn't work. Like, I'm not very fast as an artist when it comes to lighting. I always tend to do quite a few setups of light just to see what works and why, and experiment a bit and take a break from it as well, just to kind of give myself some space. Obviously, this is not something you can always do on a client project, but I think it's important to have that in your mind when you work on personal projects, because that's where you do most of your growth. That is where you're going to you can push your skills and you can push yourself, because you can spend a bit more time and kind of try different things. But I do feel like one of the things that I feel is kind of critical for like a really great 3D art is great understanding of storytelling via light. So this video is mostly first focusing on that. Oh shit. Sorry, yes, I'm Adam, and welcome to Red Green Blue. Let's start. With the settings, I'm going to try to also explain on top of it what's kind of happening here and what I'm thinking about in terms of the general mood, right? And because I think a lot of light really comes down to your personal story and what you want to say with the image. And I think it's, you know, a big part of this is just giving yourself some time to explore different ideas for lighting, right? I think one of the things that I see quite a lot is that people don't really spend enough time on lighting outside of maybe the final stage where they try to set up some lighting to kind of give it a mood. For me, I think lighting is almost as important, if not a 50% of my work. So I spend a lot of time on trying to figure out how the light will work and what's happening. And one of the things I do as well is when I use the HDR lighting, and you can see it here, is I don't rely only on the map, you know, plugging in the map itself and rotating it a few times and that's it. I think a lot of the time HDR lighting, what I've seen from, you know, different artists working on YouTube stuff, is not really used actually in the best possible way. It's usually just plugged into the environment and, you know, rotated a few times and then maybe used as a fill light with some just to get some kind of you know, more realistic light and environment in terms of reflections, like the soft reflections. For me, I try to always kind of go into, you know, some of the Octane as well elements here, and you can do this in any rendering engine. Doesn't have to be Octane. But I try to always look at you know, using some of the nodes to actually alter the HDR map itself. And one of the reasons I do this is because I feel like sometimes, you know, like a lot of the times you compromise with your HDR maps. You have to find one that works well, and then because of, you know, maybe the reflections aren't fine, or they're not in the place you want them to be, or maybe there's a hue to it, or, you know, there's a lot of things that can kind of be just not the way you want, and then you have to kind of either drop it as a background, almost like a background light in terms of your fill light, and then use some kind of spotlights to complement it and stuff. And I think that's all fine. And I think using spotlights and area lights to light your scene and add more mood is important. But I think you can get a lot more done with your HDR by just experimenting. So here you see me, I do things like, I use the conversion nodes, I use color conversion, color correction. I'm using about conversions, but like color correction node. And the reason I do this is because I can do quite a few things with this color correction. Like I can desaturate my HDR, so if there's a tint to it that I don't want, I can desaturate it. I can also use the hue slider to change the value slightly, maybe make it a bit cooler or a bit warmer. I can also use the exposure, which means I can actually have more control over the exposure of the HDR versus just the brightness and the power slider. Now a quick note that if you plug in your HDR into a color correction and you start transforming from there, your rotation X or rotation Y will not work anymore. So this is kind of it's a bit of a downside, but I try to always kind of go that route because you can see here I'm having so much more control over the HDR, and I'm doing A to B testing as well, just checking different HDR maps. And the reason I do this is also because I have a lot of silver and gold on this image. The background has this kind of black metallic thing, which actually is kind of it's more of a glass, but it's a black glass. But then I have a sword which is mostly silver and gold, and I couldn't get one light that worked well for the sword and the character, right? I mean, you could really go that road and just compromise a bit more and find one light that works on both. But I felt that maybe what's going to work here better is actually finding a couple of HDRs that will work for different elements and then mixing them. So I'm kind of using a mix node here, and I'm mixing both HDRs, but at the same time I'm testing each of them to see how it affects my scene. And and one of the things that are really great when you plug in your HDR into the environment via nodes and not just directly as a texture is that you can also scale it. And I think the scale for HDR is something that's very overlooked. It's one of those things that I notice with my own work, is that quite often you can scale the HDR just a bit and it just gives you so much more control over your image. I mean, we all been in this situation where we have the HDR and one side of it looks great and you go this is so good, and then the other side is kind of maybe there's a highlight you don't want or something else. So being able to mix the HDRs and scale them can really help you fix that. So you can see here the image already looks very balanced because I'm trying to find HDR that both gives me good shadows for the character, but I'm also testing, I'm not trying to kind of cut this here so you don't see the sword testing and the character testing. But the reason I'm switching so much and back and forth, and this is roughly probably 4 times the speed, it's because I really want to find an HDR that also gives me very nice reflections for the sword and nice fall off for the gold and things like that. And I'm really picky when it comes to lighting gold and lighting silver because I really want to make sure that I get a really nice, very rich, very satisfying look for the metal. I don't like if the metal looks dull. I don't like when it's overexposed or underexposed. So quite a lot of the time that I spend is actually finding light that complements different elements, and then I can save these different lights, and you can see I have quite few setups for my sky on the right hand side. It's because I really save every time I have a new light, I just copy that HDR and then try again. Now, one of the things that I really love about this system as well, when it comes to mixing, and you can see I'm mixing different HDRs and I test them on their own. I use things like add to add the values on the HDR. I also use multiply, and again, it really depends on your HDRs, right? Because depending on how bright they are, what kind of maps they are, if they're gradients, if they're artificially made studio kind of HDRs as opposed to mimic like a studio setup, maybe if they're actually real environments. I think one of the things you have to then try is that sometimes if they're very, very bright, you might use multiply because you don't want to have HDR that's completely bright and just kind of here you can see a bit flat. But at the same time, what I'm doing here is I'm experimenting with finding really great lighting for the sword, because one of the things that I wanted with this artwork as well is to really give the sword enough attention from the shot, and that meant really finding a really great fall off for that sword so that it feels like you're really it's something special, you know. That's kind of what I try to do with a lot of times where I light gold, and I think it's an interesting topic by itself to talk about, is you really want to make sure that you're lighting your gold like it's supposed to be a hero shot, right? Like this is one of the things that I see quite a lot. It's not used enough, is that you don't light your gold like you light your scene. You light your gold for the static images, especially to make them look very heroic and like give it a very specific attention. I found a really nice setup for the sword that works really well. And what happens here is, I have a good exposure for the sword, and I'm really happy with how the reflections feels on the gold, and I'm really happy with how the light feels on the silver, and the fall off of the gold is really good. But obviously it doesn't work for him because he's now overexposed, and not even overexposed, but the reflections are so flat on him that he looks too much like a museum statue, and I didn't want that. So I'm going to pause here again and kind of talk about what I'm doing here, which is because I use node system in my HDR, and I think that's one of the great benefits, is that once you move your HDR into nodes and you don't use the X and Y rotation anymore, that means you can actually copy that node system as a texture and do apply it to a sphere. So essentially what I'm doing here is I found the perfect light. I was very happy with how it feels for the specific setup, in terms of the sword and the gold and the silver. And now I'm moving it into a texture. And the reason I'm moving into a texture is because I wanted to project that only on the sword separately. Essentially what's happening here is you can do it in two ways, right? You can have an HDR setup for the sword and HDR setup for the character, and then do both renders and essentially use masks and mask it and use your crypto mats and things like that to do a composite of both, which it's a good way to do it, and I think it's absolutely fine. I've used it a lot as well. Obviously the other one is just to find a medium light that works for everything. Again, that's fine. But here I actually tried something else, which is a new thing that I'm trying, and I did on a few projects that I really like, which is mixing a different HDR environment for, like, let's say silver and metal, like in this case the sword, and having a different environment that I'm mixing for the character. And unfortunately, in Octane, you can't really exclude environment. You can't have two environments linked separately, so it's kind of going back to it. Essentially what it means, like, you can link your lights, right? You can link your lights up, I think now in the new Octane up to 20 lights can be linked, but you can only link one environment, which means if you have a character and you exclude that character from the environment, that's it. You can't really add another environment to include, so it's again, you can mix nodes and things like that with HDR in terms of, add and multiply and make these kind of adjust that light perfectly. But you're always going to find this situation where maybe you want to say, oh, you know what, the sword looks so much better on this HDR, even with all the changes, and then the character needs a bit more of a side shadow. Here you're going to see the final version of the image. You probably saw on the cover of this video. I really want to make the face have a nice shadow and the character not being flat. And again, the sword here, because it's so detailed, it looks better with more kind of flat lighting, because there's a lot of ornaments on it that catch the shadows by themselves with a very flat angle. So what I try to do instead is copy my HDR here into an environment texture, into a texture, and then basically I copy the same HDR that I just had now, that I rotated, that I tweaked, with the same setup into a sphere, and I apply that texture on the sphere right here. And what you see what's happening is, like, I'm doing two things here. I'm gonna because I'm using now this texture as HDR on a material, I can use light linking from the emission channel on my material, and then I'm linking that to the sword only, and I'm excluding that light from the character. At the same time, I'm excluding that environment from the sword, so that sword doesn't get the light from the character, which is this, you can see it here, is the side light. So you can see here I'm actually tweaking this light now that is separate for the sword, and I have all the settings that I had from that original HDR that I did for the environment, because the node system translates perfectly into a texture. So you can see right now what's happening is, like, I have a side light and I have a separate light for the sword. And here what I do is I have the sphere. You need to flip your normals so that they face inwards, so that the texture emission happens in the right direction. I had initially, for some reason, double-sided didn't work for me, so the flipping worked. And now you can see the sword is getting perfect light from the sphere as it was the HDR from the environment object, right? And you can see I can tweak the light for the sword. Now there will be some light leakage purely on the side of the fact that the sword is very reflective, so it reflects back on the character, but it's very mild. You can see that I can tweak the sword and I can make it quite dark or quite bright, and it doesn't really reflect too much, but there will be some of that where it might reflect back too much. And you can see here I'm linking, and the environment is unticked for the sword, because I don't want the whole environment now to affect my sword. I only want my sphere to affect the sword, because I'm really specific about the lighting and the reflection. But at the same time, you can see it here. If I turn it off, the sword doesn't get any light from the environment anymore. And I think it really gives it's a different way of working. But it gives you a full control over the elements. So here I actually decided to link not just the sword, but also the butterflies and the upper sphere, which is like the clock from the game, because I felt that everything that gold and silver should have the same, more or less the same direction of reflections. And also I just liked how it looked, because it has very punchy, I specifically made that light fit well with the nature of the gold. So it really complements the elements here. Here I'm just doing some region render as well, just to kind of see, because it is a bit slow. There's a lot of like reflections and stuff, and you can see now I have full control over the character's light in the background, and I have a separate slider on the left hand side for my materials, which is the emissives. But because it's all linked, I can basically have two HDRs that are affecting the scene separately, and you can see the sphere here. Now the small tweak that I've noticed, and this is something that you see if I rotate it, it doesn't do anything because it's now projected with these sliders here, so I have to use the projection from the tag. But one thing that I noticed that, and it must be a Octane limitations, is that you have to go to a Octane tag and change the visibility of that sphere, not just hide it from the camera, but just also lower the transparency. Otherwise it will affect shadows and stuff. Even if you untick the visible shadows, I think it's just the fact that there's a large object that Octane doesn't know how to handle. I don't know exactly if it's a glitch or it's just like how it works, So here I'm back at the scene. And one of the things you see, I changed a bit of the model was changed a bit, and from the first one I still use the same lighting. There's nothing really changed here. The sword isn't lit now just because I noticed that the lighting on the sphere from the sword was kind of slow, so I keep it till the end of the render. I'm gonna just tweak it at the end, just because I figured that it was just too slow for more explorations. And what I did here was I changed the model slightly just because I felt the background was too heavy. It almost felt too mechanical with the larger ring and things like that, and I really wanted to make it very subtle and almost give it a bit more like kind of a organic, but also a kind of complex feel. So I made a background out of splines, and I use like cloners and rotations, and made some patterns that feel very organic and have almost this kind of there's a bit of like this kind of very rich feel to it, but I also kind of wanted to make that background feel like it almost has somewhat of a like a nature inspired vibe, right? Because the background in a way is inspired by the tree that's from the game. That's like almost like I could probably say it's a tree of life, depending on the metaphor. So I kind of started tweaking that, and then while we're back here, one of the things that I do now, because I have the lights, the HDR set up, I have the sword separately, so I know I'm going to light it with that sphere at the end. Now I decided to like look at the larger mood, and there's few things that I do in my lighting, which I shown before. One of the things is that I love to do is anytime I use a light, I go heavy into fall-offs, and that goes into the distribution channel on your light. And for that I use either gradients, I use a fall-off node. I think is important because I think one of the things that really make great lighting is to have a full control over how far it reaches and kind of how it's painting the image for you. And you know, one of the things that I like doing is, like, once I set up my lights, I try to always make sure that both the sides of the light, you know, and that depends not just for the side of the shadows, because obviously if you use surface brightness, that correlation can change. But I also want to make sure that I have a good mood, and it is something very subjective. But for me, you know, I try to always look at edges and highlights and where I'm driving the direction of the eye, right? And big part of that is that secondary or a tertiary lights that I add, that are usually tinted lights. Those lights are usually warm. Sometimes they could be cool, but that's more for like a side if I need to maybe, you know, lift the character a bit. But for the most part, I will use warm lights, because in this case especially, as I use gold in almost all my work and kind of silverish, goldish materials, warm lights usually complement gold better than cold lights. I mean, you can do something interesting with colder lights, like maybe more greenish, because that complements gold as well. But warm is very good for like just getting more punch out of your highlights in the gold, right? So here one of the techniques that I use quite a lot, and you can see it here, is really just using spheres as an emissives. And you know, I use normal lights, I use area lights, I use target area lights and things like that. But one of the reasons I use spheres, and I think you know, it could be spheres, it could be different objects. Sometimes it could be, you know, like a torus, a donut, or even something made that's kind of, you know, a shape out of cubes. That's kind of not really just a single shape, that maybe it's more distorted. It's because I feel it gives me more natural fall off. I noticed that a lot of the time, and could be just down to limitations of lights, if they don't have a physical presence and they tend to just project, they could look a bit artificial. And I noticed that something about the shape of the light, if it's like a sphere or a torus, will naturally give you what you expect from a light to happen, which is a volume. I know it's kind of subjective, and obviously, you know, normal lights can do a lot of the same stuff, and you can project from an object as well. But there's something about, for me, almost feeling like I'm moving light bulbs around, which I just enjoy. That kind of gives me a very good control over how I feel the light should be represented, you know, like how I would imagine there would be a light bulb somewhere. I'm also kind of playing around here with the depth of field. Kind of interesting thing probably to mention as well is, I don't really, because this image doesn't have much depth of field at the final render, but what I try to do is I try to make it very subtle, like, you know, relatively speaking, because I'm using 600mm camera here, so it's very flat. I don't want any distortion, because it's more of a kind of a perspective poster where I don't want things to be too stretched. So I really kind of make sure that the lights, you know, I'm getting good control over the lights, but at the same time, because I have to separate objects in space so that the light doesn't leak too much on different things, or, you know, it doesn't light things that I don't want to lit. Then for that, what I do is I separate things. But so then I have a flat camera, very wide angle, so that I can get a very kind of flat look to the image. Not flat in the sense of flatness, but just not having distortion from the elements being too far and stuff like that. So one of the things that I do here is I try to also do a very, very subtle depth of field that feels almost unperceivable, but it's I think once you render it, there's a certain fall off to the sharpness of the image, which is kind of like if you ever see how digital painters paint, or even normal painters. It's almost like your brush strokes are a bit thicker and less detailed. You know, they're less away of the focus you want to be. So like if you have someone that paints a face, they usually would have less detail on the hair, right? Because that's not what it's going to be in the frame for them in terms of your attention. So I think having a very subtle depth of field that's not visible but will soften up the image also helps. And just looking at here, you know, I'm kind of still going back to my lighting. So you know, the point that I was making in the beginning was really look at your light and give it some time. So, you know, I tend to go back and look at the temperature of my light and the fall-offs and the size of the spheres that I use to project the lights, because a lot of that gives me more control. And I mean, one of the, you know, and this could be just subjective, but I also need time for that. Like, I'm not someone who can just drop it in and say, oh, this works perfectly, like obviously I could reuse stuff from different projects, and I do that as well. But I also don't have a reason not to give some effort. Like, it sounds weird because sometimes you want to get stuff done and get stuff out, but at the same time, I always think about, what is the best thing that I can do here, not just something that's going to work fine, but something that really will complement the project. And I think a lot of that, it just comes to time, and I'm not very fast. So for me, I can't just go in and in 10 minutes have a light setup that I'm super happy with. I usually just do, 3, 4, 10 light setups. I give myself even a day after to like look at the images again and say, okay, this works better here, this works better there. I think a lot of this, comes to light, especially when it comes to lighting. I think, we expect a solution that will work because, if we use like 3-point light or whatever we use. But for me, it really comes down to the fact that I think sometimes you just have to give yourself some time to light the scene, give it the second to think about how it feels. Is it something that looks similar? Here's I bring in another image that it's going to be part of the set. The set is not done yet, but I was looking at that lighting as well, because there's certain elements that I like how the light flows and stuff like that. And then you see also here, I'm just tweaking the materials for the final render. That's for the character. I kind of felt that his albedo or his base color was a bit too bright because of the exposure, so I pulled it back a bit. And I'm also playing with my camera and my bloom. Like, these are not super important for the final render because I usually do bloom in post. It depends. I use this bloom. I can, it's because it's separate as a separate layer in my EXR. I don't really like worry too much if the bloom is a bit too high or a bit too low, because I can always boost it in the post. But I do want to get a nice bloom to have a feel of what's happening. And here you can see me still, even, I'm getting so close to the final. And this is the black version of the image. Obviously you saw the render it's in red. I made all 3 versions at the end. I like the red ones more, but the lighting is basically identical. I made a tiny tweaks to the light at the end, but the base light for all the 3 ones is the same. And then, I'm trying to get that final light that really feels like it's working for me. And I know a big part of, and kind of going back to why it takes so much time, is you can see here, I know that the face, the sword and the face will be the key element of this artwork for me, at least for me in terms of the storytelling, and that means the eyes and the shape of the face, the nose, have to have a nice fall off. And so I spent some time on that. I have a separate lights that I link only to the eyes. But in those kind of early previews that are a bit overexposed, but I'm going to pull them back at the end. What I'm going to just do is get some nice reflections, just to give the eyes more life and things like that. But I also want to make sure that I don't link just to the lights, because I think it's very easy to get like this disjoint. If you link all your lights separately, so to like different elements, it might feel like your model is disconnected, because like the eyes and the face might have a light that feels conflicting, like the direction of the light might not work. So like when we look at the final image here, you can see what I end up doing is, because I end up working on this a bit more, is light. There's actually a few lights here that I use, and what I do is I look at this from a perspective of, okay, I have the good light now for the silhouette of the character. Then I use the same light with linking, but I lower it so that it has a bit of a follow on the eyes, so that the eyes do follow the same colors, but they're not overexposed, because there is glass in the eye, not glass obviously, but like the liquid, and it's in this case it's a specular material as well. I try to pull it back so it's not too glittery and not too bright. Again, in kind of a more realistic render, I wouldn't worry about this, because there would be one light and I would have to readjust things to make them realistic. But because it's so stylized, I try to obviously push it to be very punchy. That means I have to link those eyes separately so they're not overexposed. But at the same time, I don't want them to be disconnected, because they will feel like I'm losing the connection between the character and the eyes and the elements. So that's one thing about linking the lights. I think you can tell where they are disconnected if they tend to feel too separate from each element. So that's why, for example, when I have this model here, what I end up doing is I really look at the fact that there should be few lights. That's why I use the color lights with the spheres to add cohesion to the sword and the character at the same time, because that light will bind those two different types of lights, right? Because the sword has a separate sphere to light it, and that light looks great. But if I don't add connection light between that and the character, it will feel separate. That's why I have the kind of orange light that connects both elements, because it has it falls on the character, it falls on the sword. There's a glitter of that light in the eyes as well, so that everything feels connected, right? Despite of those lights often being linked separately and maybe having different values, so that they're not overexposing elements. But I think that's like the core takeaway, I would say, because I always think about the fact that I think spend some time on your lighting. Don't rush it. Give yourself a day or two, or however long you need when you work. You obviously want to finish your projects and move on, and there's less of that on the client side, because when you work in the client project, there's obviously more strict deliveries and stuff like that. But I think especially for your personal project, it's important, if you have time, just to explore light and see what works, and those benefits will carry to the next phase of your work, right? Which again, it's going to make that process better and easier. So I hope you guys like it. I'm going to finish here. I'll let you go around, I think 30 minutes, so it's a decent length. Hope you guys enjoyed, and see you soon.